Now let's talk about commas, clauses, and phrases. So first, what is a subordinate clause? It's one of Santa's little helpers. No, but seriously, a subordinate clause is another term for a dependent clause. And you can find more on that answer in the speaker notes. So when you're determining whether or not a clause or phrase is essential, you need to think about like how it relates to the rest of the sentence. And if a clause or phrase is essential to the sentence, then it would change the meaning of a sentence. So if you were to remove it, then it changes the basic meaning of what's going on, then that means it's essential. If you were to remove it and it maybe takes out some additional details, but the overall meaning remains the same, then it is non-essential. And how does this relate to comma usage? Well, you use commas to mark non-essential clauses or phrases. And also, if you find yourself including a lot of these additional phrases in there, consider whether or not they even need to be there at all. So first, essential and non-essential phrases. Here's an example of an essential phrase. We saw the award-winning movie Green Book. Now, why is the phrase Green Book an essential phrase? That's right. It's because we need to know which award-winning movie we saw. So if we were to remove that, we would say we saw an award-winning movie, but we can't really say the award-winning movie because we don't know which award-winning movie you're talking about. Now, non-essential phrase, here we're still using the phrase Green Book as our phrase. So we saw the 2019 winner of the Academy Award competition for Best Picture, Green Book. There's still we're still using that same phrase, but if you look at the way it's used compared to the rest of the sentence, since we have all of that other information in our primary sentence, the 2019 winner of the Academy Award competition for Best Picture, we don't really need to have the name Green Book in there. We know which one it is because there's only one. Now, essential and non-essential clauses. An essential clause, so here's one. It says, reporters who do not read the style book should not criticize their editors. We're looking at the phrase who do not read the style book. So if we were to remove that phrase from the sentence, then it would read, reporters should not criticize their editors, which is different from reporters who do not read the style book should not criticize their editors. In the one where we include that phrase, who do not read the style book, we are specifying that only reporters who read the style book should bring up a critique to their editors, and reporters who have not gone and reviewed the material should not offer criticism. Now, an example of a non-essential clause, we have the sentence, my father, who is retired, does volunteer work. Now, if we look at the sentence and we have the phrase who is retired in there, if we take out the phrase who is retired, we would have my father does volunteer work. Now, does who is retired change how he's doing the volunteer work? It does not. It just gives us additional context. So we know that, hey, this person is retired, and that gave them the opportunity to do more volunteer work than they might excuse me, than they might have if they were working full time. Now, here's another one, essential and non-essential clauses or phrases to review. Let's look at the sentence, he and his wife Mary have one daughter. Now, the question here is, does the word Mary, so this person's name, does it require commas around it or not? So the first version is he and his wife, comma, Mary, comma, have one daughter, period. Or he and his wife Mary, no commas, have one daughter. Now remember, what was our rule regarding whether or not something is essential or non-essential? That's right, non-essential words, clauses, and phrases have commas around them. So in this case, it would be the version where Mary is set off by 2 commas. So we don't actually need to know the name of his wife. Either way, he and his wife still have one daughter. However, if we had a situation where he has several friends and he and one of his friends have a daughter together, then it would be important for us to know which friend is the co-parent of their child. Now, empty words and phrases. A common trait when we talk about empty words and phrases, these are things that add to the word count, but not the meaning of a sentence. So these are phrases that we often use when we're speaking to one another, but they aren't necessary when it comes to adding any kind of meaning or anything to a sentence. And this also comes into play when we talk about redundancies as well. But the difference would be that something redundant is going to be repeated when it doesn't need to be. And empty words and phrases are words and phrases that lack any meaning. So they aren't really adding anything to the sentence. Now, an empty word is a type of vague term that fails to add information to a sentence. And a few examples of these would be the words very, really, and the 2 words a lot, a space L-O-T. Those are actually considered one word. And then, or a little, a space L-I-T-T-L-E. So either version of those 2 are both considered part of that empty word or vague term category. And instead of using these types of empty words, we want to be more accurate with how we're describing something and include specific numbers or places or other specific information. For example, if we said Frank had a lot of bobbleheads, well, how many are we calling a lot? If you are a bobblehead enthusiast, 100 might not seem like very many. But if you are someone who hates bobbleheads, then that might seem like too many. So we have to be more specific, and we say Frank had 123 bobbleheads. So we're finding out that extra piece of information. Now, an empty phrase is going to be very similar to an empty word or vague term, except that now we have a cluster of words, and altogether they fail to add any information to a sentence. They're those kinds of word fillers that we use in our everyday language. So whenever we're writing, we want to improve upon our everyday language by removing these filler words. So here's an example. Despite the fact that tuition increased 10%, the instructor's salaries remained the same. Now, in this sentence, the phrase, the fact that, would be our empty phrase. It is not adding anything to this sentence. It is, if we are stating it in a report, then we know this percentage is a fact. We don't need someone to tell us it's a fact. So it can stand by itself and not need the phrase, the fact that. So we would make an adjustment by removing the phrase the fact that, and we would say instead, despite the 10% tuition increase, instructor salaries remained the same. So we removed the unnecessary phrase and rewrote it to make a little more sense as well. Now, we also have things where we have an empty subject. And this is another one where you often come across this in everyday language, but it is something you want to improve upon in our writing. So instead of having an empty subject like there it goes or something like that, or uh, sometimes it can also happen where we end up with pronouns that are not in the appropriate place as well. But for now, let's stick with phrases where we have a sentence like this. For example, there is a dog in the park. Now, it is a complete sentence. It is clear what we're talking about. There's a dog in the park. It's a very normal sentence, but we want to improve upon it. We want to make this clearer for our audience who's reading it. And usually this requires us changing our syntax, changing the sentence structure, so we can have a clear subject and have that subject performing whatever kind of action is required. So we go from there is a dog in the park to creating an active sentence. Now, what should be our subject? Well, we're talking about a dog, right? So maybe we would say a dog is in the park. And where is the dog, or what is the dog doing? It is being in the park. So that by changing our sentence structure and putting a dog as our subject, we have a state of being verb in there, and we know what's going on with the dog. Then we can create an action verb sentence. So not only is it active, where the subject, the dog, is doing the acting, we also have the dog performing an action instead of a state of being now. We can say a dog runs in the park, or a dog ran in the park. And then that means the dog, we can say specifically what the dog did when it was in the park. Now, another common issue is what are called dangling or misplaced modifiers. And this is another one related to syntax issues, that sentence structure, where we get a little tied up and excited, usually figuring out how to explain something to someone, and maybe our subject isn't quite lining up the way it needs to in the sentence. So in this case, we have a misplaced modifier. And what that means is we have a part of the sentence where it's failing to refer to a logical other portion of the sentence. And maybe there's a suggestion of a subject, but there isn't actually one being named in the sentence. And I do have your checklist here for checking for dangling modifiers. So to start, does an opening phrase suggest an action without naming the actor? And if that does not happen, then of course there isn't a problem, but let's say it did. So an opening phrase in your sentence suggests an action but isn't naming an actor. And then does the subject of the sentence name the actor? If it does not, then you need to revise your dangling modifier. So here's an example of what might happen whenever you have a dangling or misplaced modifier. Opening the window to let out a huge bumblebee, the car accidentally swerved into an oncoming car. Now, what's going on in this sentence? So, we're starting out with this ing verb right at the beginning. And not always, but often that will be a little bit of a clue for you that maybe your sentence structure needs some adjustment. If you're starting with an ing verb like this, and we read it, opening the window to let out a huge bumblebee, the car accidentally swerved into an oncoming car. So what subject do we have here? Well, we don't really have one that relates to opening, right? We have the car in here, and we know the car couldn't open the door by itself unless we're talking about Transformers. So we need to redo this. Something needs to change. So you might revise it by saying, when the driver opened the window to let out a huge bumblebee, the car accidentally swerved into an oncoming car. So the driver is clearly opening the window, and you don't want to assume that your audience knows there's an actor in here, and that's usually the core of what happens, is if you're assuming your audience knows what you're talking about. So don't assume, go in and correct it instead. Now, here's another fun Merriam-Webster blog post for you. Should you end a sentence with a preposition? Well, if we follow this blog link, you can see that they actually give you a little TLDR at the beginning too. And it says, can you end a sentence with a preposition? Yes, you can. And ending a sentence with a preposition is permissible in the English language, and apparently has been around for quite some time. But the idea of avoiding it started with a couple of writers named Joshua Poole and John Dryden, who were trying to align the language with Latin, which it is not Latin, it is English. But there is no reason to suggest that ending a sentence with a preposition is wrong. So, if anything, you should be more concerned about those other elements and making sure that your subjects make sense, that you are using an active sentence structure, and attempting to develop your sentences with action verbs instead. So focusing on those other things, and hey, if it happens to end with a preposition, it isn't that big a deal. All right, that brings us to the end of our grammar chapter. And until next time, I will see you in class.